Hi there, everybody. So I don't think that these two gentlemen need too much introduction. Andrea from Canadian Tire, who I did hear on a previous panel describing to an American audience what Canadian Tire does, and it was quite hilarious and fairly lengthy. I don't think the Americans were getting it. And Brookes, of course, from FLO, based in Quebec City, although he is here. So welcome today. So you can tell by the way that they're dressed that they've been working together for quite a long time. I don't think that this was planned. They seem to just be absorbing each other's personalities. So let's talk briefly about how this partnership between FLO and Canadian Tire came about.
Sure, thanks Don, and welcome everybody. I'm going to say late 2016, Canadian Tire started kicking the tires around the EV charging space and trying to understand what it meant. And for us, it really was a strategic initiative. Inherently, we are, in the automotive aftermarket, and we knew this was a nascent market for us, but nonetheless, we needed to understand how we could participate in it. So at the time, knowing that we didn't know anything about the space, we decided to do an RFP and basically find out who out in the space knew what they were doing and how they were doing it, and kind of bring that knowledge to us. And at the time, FLO was one of the initial kind of participants in that, and so we had the opportunity to meet them and walk through a whole bunch of our objectives and the agenda that we had, and ended up creating a partnership with them in the first sort of funding round through Enercare Canada, which was FLO's approach to getting chargers out into the market. So that was kind of where we went to first principles and said, we're good at retail, we're pretty good at real estate, but we don't really know much about this market, and we were on a journey of learning about more.
And Brookes, what about from FLO's perspective? Where were you at the time?
Yeah, at the time, we had just secured some Enercare funding, like Andrea had said. So FLO helped shape the Enercare funding program, and Enercare had a goal of Canadian success. So we saw Canadian Tire as being that link. For us with EV charging, what's really important is being around drivers, EV drivers, and Canadian Tire having like a store literally within 10 minutes of almost every Canadian in the country. It really made for a great partnership to be able to create that connecting network. In Ontario, it was big because back in 2016, 2017, Ontario was struggling to get DC fast charging kind of going, right? So we took on the investment internally at FLO in addition to the Enercare investment to roll out over 20 locations with Canadian Tire and over about 13 locations with Cadillac Fairview shopping centers for that program, and we deployed it over about a 2-year period.
So, Andrea, you mentioned when we were speaking before the panel that this was never really a profit play for Canadian Tire. So why was it important back then, more explicitly, to get in on this?
It's a great question. I think anybody here in the industry that is not a pure play in either EV manufacturing of vehicles or in the space of providing the energy, it's more of a strategic initiative. And again, you go back to our heritage. Our heritage is in automotive. We felt it was important to understand how does that particular customer interact with us. We know we probably have them as a customer already, especially the early adopters, but it was a matter of understanding what their needs were. I think somebody earlier mentioned, getting closer to your customer and understanding how will that drive your strategy going forward. So that was really the impetus that got us into it. One of the things that we found very intriguing about FLO was their passion for the customer. And in their case, for the EV driver, or for the folks that are providing EV charging systems. We felt that aligned very well with our passion for the customer and the need for us to, again, learn and be on a journey of how do we make this relevant for our business, and how do we tie back to the consumer that we know is probably already part of our portfolio of customers.
Right. And Brookes, do you want to jump in on that idea of passion for the customer? How does that play out?
Yeah, it all aligned with customer experience, right, and loyalty. There's a big brand loyalty on the Canadian Tire side, which made it so attractive for us from the program. But the other piece is when you look at gas, right, and what you experience with gas, when is a gas station hardly ever down? When do you experience a down gas pump? And for us, for FLO, how we've built our business and our network is all around reliability, because for us, that's the most important piece of the customer experience, is that thing going to be working when I get there? It's mission critical infrastructure that we're putting in. So for us, the reliability was the most important part back in 2017, 2018. Even when you look at the industry today, your average uptime of a DC fast charger is 65% to 82%. It's dismal, right? On FLO, our minimal goal is 98%. And a goal of gas is what, like 99.9, and you're mandated by that from the government. So in order to get that EV transition and that conversion, right, you have to make sure that you're delivering on that reliability, or it's just not going to work out for the industry in general.
Right. And so you've been doing this for, let's call it 7 years now. So what has been the return on investment for this at Canadian Tire, if not hard cash?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, for us, it's more about creating that connection with the consumer. And that's why we did do a small investment in our own charging infrastructure, and again applied for Enercare funding. But really, we become more of a site host and try to create a marketplace for the consumer to come and charge at a Canadian Tire store. That generates footprints or footsteps to your store. We need to figure out ways of monetizing that versus, again, trying to make a fortune out of just the EV charging space. I think anybody in the industry would tell you that the business case is soft on that part of it, but it's more about how do you attract the consumer, how do you stay relevant with them, and again, how do we market to them better and entice them to come in and shop the store, much like what the folks at Ongaro were talking about.
Right. Now, I mean, automotive is obviously a big part of Canadian Tire's offering, so is this also a play to get more people to associate you with bringing, like, can people bring their EV cars into
100%.
Canadian Tire for servicing?
Yeah, no, that's a great call out, Dawn. For us, it's important. Again, it's in our heritage. It's a cornerstone business for us. EV cars are different than ICE vehicles, but they still require, tires, other parts of friction, suspension. So that's a big piece of business for Canadian Tire. We want to make sure we keep it, maintain it, and grow it. And that was just a new avenue for us to attract that consumer.
Right. And what about ROI from FLO's perspective with this partnership?
Yeah, the business case for EV charging in general is getting much better. Like back in 2017, your business case for DC fast charging was kind of 10 to 15 years at best for return on investment, even with the Enercare funding. Now it's getting into like the 6-year, 7-year, 8-year because of EV adoption, right, and the growth. We heard this morning about the new kind of rate base in Ontario for energy, right? We have that same thing in Quebec, same thing in BC. So it's really starting to become a much more positive business case. And I would say that's why we've kind of branched out both from selling stations and running the network as a network operator, but also looking for site hosts in our real estate investment strategy that we're working on with Canadian Tire to expand more on their properties, right? So the faster we get that out, the more, again, that connected network goes to create that revenue.
Right. So, you've learned some hard lessons along the way, I would say, probably both of you. So, Andrea, do you want to speak a little bit about some of the pitfalls you encounter, particularly early on?
Sure. I think, again, for folks that are not in the space, there was a lot of learning. One of the things that I think became very evident early was it's difficult to scale this type of a program. And again, for us, we sort of stepped back and said, so what are we really good at? We're really good at real estate, we're really good at retail. So the realization of you need to treat this like a real estate project as opposed to an EV amenity became very clear. And what I mean by that is when we first went into the market, and Brookes can talk about this as well, we did a lot of shortcuts. As opposed to following a very, I would say, defined path. And yes, you got some stuff deployed very quickly, but you also ran into a lot of other difficulties along the way. We stepped back. Now we manage and treat this like we're building another Canadian Tire store. So it falls directly in line with all the requirements and all the kind of approvals and things that you need to do in order to get a bricks and mortar site up and running. And that sounds like you slow things down, but actually you get things right. And you make sure all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted, which saves you in the end.
Right.
So for us, again, stick to our knitting. Those are the things that we're good at, and we rely on partners like FLO to help manage the process of getting those units out of the ground and operational.
Right. So where did those learnings come from? Because you had mentioned that initially you were a provider, and then you switched to sort of a site.
Yeah, and again, that was part of our, I'm going to say strategy up front was we need to understand and get under the covers and like, what is this EV driver about? What is required to get a site up and running? So hence we went for our own funding tranche and
Right.
have a small number of sites up and running. We have about 36 sites across Canada that we operate. That was really about, that's one of the learning pieces we needed to engage in so that we could be a better judge of who to partner with.
Right.
And so we're very proud of the fact that, I think we heard some folks talking about the number of ports they have. We have just over 1,000 ports across Canada through the various partners that we are associated with. So for us, it's given us lots more insight into how that consumer interacts, at least with the EV charger. There's still some more to learn. And I'd say we're a long way from understanding the customer at an intimate level, but we're starting to understand their behavior, at least at the charging station.
Right. And Brookes, what have you sort of figured out along the way, or some of the pitfalls you hit?
Yeah, like Andrea said, I think it was easier in 2017, 2018 when we were doing it than it is now because there's been more process put in place, right? And everybody is getting more educated on what's happening, and there's more competitors in a play, right? Canadian Tire has a partnership with Ivy, with Electrify Canada, and a couple of others, and with us along the way too. And when you look at how the growth of that happens, you look for companies and organizations when you're looking at site acquisition that have multiple properties, so you can get from point A to point B faster of getting deployments instead of dealing with individual sites to really kind of span your trajectory on the deployments. But right now, what you're seeing is a lot more requirement as far as I would say like servitudes and making sure that all the landowners sign off on the construction capabilities. Utilities are becoming more educated, so it's almost like in a way we're almost getting in our own way with how much of different kind of new things we're putting in place from the learnings that we've done. So has my life gotten any easier? No, it's gotten harder, I would say. Right? Because before we'd go out to a property with Frida and we'd point to that parking spot and say, let's go there. And they'd be like, okay, let's go there. Right? And then a month later, we'd have a charger in the ground. Now it's let's go there. And then we'd go back 3 weeks later and it's like, oh, the garden center's now going to go there. So let's go over here. And it's, well, that's where snow goes. So and then we can't do that because like some other REIT has ownership of that area. So it's gotten more difficult, I would say. But it's also, that's the fun part, right? It's figuring that stuff out and breaking it down.
I'm going to say landlords and property owners are a lot more informed. And in 2016 and 17, it was like, how much space is it going to take? Oh yeah, that's fine, go ahead and put it in there. Yeah. Now they're asking a lot more questions. And they want to know more about, I'll call it, again, the business model.
Yep.
Because again, everybody wants to try to monetize that particular slot of land.
Right.
So there is more process around it, but at least it protects us from problems that could kind of crop up later down the pipe. So it's a yin and a yang. We're trying to balance, not creating too much bureaucracy, but at the same time, future-proofing that location and future-proofing the relationship that we have with either FLO or any of our partners.
Yeah, because this is like a 10 and 20-year relationship, right? It's a commitment. So these things, even though they're only a parking spot wide, that's like a massive building of power that's being taken up. So you definitely don't want to get something in the ground and realize Canadian Tire didn't have rights to that location and now we've got to rip it out of the ground and the investment is gone, right? So you really want to make sure everything is connected and in place because you need that 10 and 20-year outlook to, again, make the business case work.
Right. And so talk a little bit about sort of regulatory environment in terms of dealing with municipalities and the province and then the feds and like how complicated is it or how do you navigate that?
That's why we have a full policy team that deals with that day in and day out. I'm not in that kind of mindset. Those guys are magicians with what they do. I think where they've really been pushing a lot is from uptime reliability, right? When we think about it, we're all taxpayers. A lot of this stuff is taxpayer dollars. And to see stuff get put in the ground that's getting ripped out within 3 years, or that's down because you can't rely on it, that's a big piece that we've really kind of driven with policy in the framework. And then like the good news that came out this morning with the utility rates to make EV charging more affordable for both the site host, right, the operator and the driver. Everything is starting to come together, but yeah, that's for the policy team of like 15 people that we have on board.
Yeah, it was good to hear Minister Smith talk about, at least at the at the provincial level, listening to the operators and saying, you've made this really complicated. You know, there's multiple utilities, there's multiple ways to apply, and Brooks's point, you need to have an army of people that know how to sort through all of that, because we joke, when you've built one EV station, all you've learned is how to build that one EV station in that community, because you go to the next one and it's a whole new set of rules, regs, and process. So that was music to my ears to hear that we're going to harmonize that and kind of create a more common footprint or application process. And again, to Brooks's point and what Minister Smith said about coming to an agreed upon single price point for a kilowatt hour for an EV charger, that would be fantastic, because again, I come from the fuel space, the traditional fuel space, and we make it really simple for the consumer to look at two gas stations and say, oh, it's $1.30 here, $1.40 here, I'm going to go here or here. I defy anybody to understand how that works when they go to an EV charging station. It changes depending on the time of day, depending on if that charging station has hit demand charge levels. So for a consumer, they're used to seeing their home bill and understanding how this works. Now they go and get their car charged, and it's different. And I'm not sure I understand why. And it creates, I'm going to say, just dissonance with the consumer. We're trying to make it simple. I mean, you know, again, go back to first principles. Have a passion for the customer. Let's listen to the customer and find out what is it we need to do to help them along the journey of EV adoption.
I mean, I'm interested in that whole idea of consumers not knowing what to expect price-wise. Like, what are the swings like? I mean, I would imagine in Quebec, for instance, where power is a heck of a lot cheaper than it is here, for instance, or like, what are the swings looking like?
So the swings, I would say, haven't come in like fully yet, like you kind of see in fuel, right? Only recently have providers, network operators been able to charge by the kilowatt hour, because it was looked at as reselling electricity. So us as a reseller of EV charging, we had to sell by the hour or by the session, because that way it kind of doesn't look like you're reselling electricity, you're selling this session of time. So for the most part, it's been time-based over the last many years. Usually in Ontario, DC fast charging was anywhere from about $20 to $25 an hour, right? And depending on how big your battery was and how fast your car could take that, some people benefited a lot better in that hourly mix than others. So that's where kilowatt hour pricing comes in. It's going to be more fair based on the vehicle. But at the same time, it's not going to be as low as I think what people expect of, I should be paying the 6 cents that I'm paying at home in public, because you have to, it's a different beast, right? You have to pay to keep that stuff up. You have to pay to keep it maintained and installed. So it will give a more fair piece. In Quebec, you're definitely right. It was about $12.50 to $15 because of their special rate base. And that's what we'll also get in Ontario, very similar. But we don't see, as a network operator, we really don't see a difference. So if Canadian Tire is doing the $1.35 rate and Esso across the street is doing $1.36, and you see the lineup down the street because Canadian Tire is cheaper, we don't really see that in EV. So we have stations where we're charging $15, Hydro-Quebec is charging $12.50, and we see no difference in usage. We don't see a lineup for the Hydro-Quebec piece, because people are really kind of charging where they're going and plugging in for that period of time. And the location is what kind of hones them in. And I think that's big for retailers, big for the earlier piece around grocery is people are basically, you're in title focus for 15 to 35 to 45 minutes of shopping. So it creates that mechanism to make it worthwhile.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. You see a lot of, primarily gas station companies like Parkland and Couche-Tard scrambling to figure out how to offer EV charging. But I mean, Canadian Tire has a massive leg up because there's somewhere to go.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's our strength. We'll call it dirt strength. We've got good real estate. One of the earlier presenters talked about, being near major thoroughfares, having, sites located where people live, high density and whatnot. So again, going back to first principles, when we first started on this, we started looking at it and using the data that we already had and saying, geez, some of this is exactly aligned with what is important to the EV driver. Proximity to where they live, ease of access in and out. Where's the vehicle population? Where, again, intuitively, but it was one of those things where you look at it and go, oh, geez, there's a lot of cars here. Well, if there's a lot of cars here, there's probably a lot of EV drivers too. Well, that probably makes sense to have some form of charging in that vicinity. So again, it was a good learning for us to note that there are some, I'm going to say, basic consumer principles that we were able to apply and embellish the information that folks like experts at FLO or any of the other major charging providers could provide as well to help us sort through where should we be placing that charger to maximize both the opportunity for a FLO or for Canadian Tire.
Right. Now, we're still sort of waiting for, massive uptake of EVs, and it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. I imagine people are waiting for the infrastructure to roll out, and infrastructure, capital outlays are, it's expensive, waiting for mass adoption to happen. So how do you kind of balance that right now while we wait in this awkward space?
I see it as we've really crossed that, right? EV is definitely mainstream in my opinion right now. The adoption is definitely there. People are lined up waiting for vehicles. A lot of it is sometimes issues with battery availability and chipsets, especially during COVID. There was a big slowdown. But you can pretty much charge almost everywhere and have some kind of reliable charging. I drove to Grand Rapids the other day. I drove to Quebec City 2 weeks ago. I have no worry about driving a long distance anymore.
Yeah.
And that's really changed, right? In 2018, 2019, it was like I was white knuckling sometimes going to Quebec, right?
Right.
To make that stretch. But so I think a lot of that shift has happened, and more people are being educated on the benefits of charging at home. Right, and never having to go back to, unfortunately, a Canadian Tire Gas Plus, but usually you have a second vehicle, so they fill that up there. But waking up every morning now with a full battery, it's just that benefit that kind of removes a lot of that piece. And I would think almost everybody in here probably has a friend or they're driving their own EV right now. So that education piece is being talked about constantly.
Right. So where do you, what advice do you have for other people looking to, or other retailers or sort of businesses looking to get into
everybody's going to have their own lens through which they look at how do they determine where they're going to invest energy, time, people, capital. So I don't know I can advise on that. I think it's, again, go back to first principles. What's important to your customer? And is there, in this space, does it make sense for you to be involved in it? I think the other part that you need to really focus on, especially if you're not pure play, is find the right partner or partners to be in the space with. Do your homework there. Again, when we did our RFP back 7 years ago, I think there were 7 or 8 different organizations that we looked at, including FLO. I think FLO's the only one that's still kicking around. So keep that in mind. This is still a nascent industry. So there's going to be a lot of churn. I mean, you come to events like this and you're going to see lots of new players. You're going to see lots of consolidation, I'm sure, is coming as well. So do your homework, make sure you're partnered with the right folks so that you can maximize the knowledge and the expertise they have. And then the last piece I would say is make sure you've got data coming. Data is so important. Again, going back to early adopters, it was about range anxiety. So, okay, we can figure that out. Now it's about trip assurance, and it's about knowing that when I go to your site, there's a charging port available, and it's operable. And so going back to, again, first principles on this, having that high 90% availability is super important. And again, that's one of the other learnings is, again, we're typical, retailer. We went, small footprint to see and try what was going on. I would suggest you'd never want to have anything less than 4 charging units, I call them fast charging units, in any deployment. You need redundancy. Like, things happen. We all know that. Things happen, and if you're down to 1 or 2, it really makes it tough for that customer experience because you're going to disappoint people.
Right. Advice from you, Brookes?
I think he said it really well. I don't have much to say. You should come sell for us more often. No, but definitely do your due diligence and look into multiple manufacturers, multiple network operators. A good way to look at organizations is how much funding they've been a part of or won, right? Because the funding programs that are actually doling out the cash know exactly who is more reliable than others. I'm not saying there's preferential treatment, but you can see who they're more trusting when they're awarding. That is a big piece. Other piece that you want to look at is, I mentioned back in like the COVID days, a struggle was components, right? Even we struggled with components on like cables and stuff. If you don't have access to spare parts locally, you're going to have a significant issue with downtime. In a lot of cases, that downtime can be months and months and months just waiting for a basic cable, right? So you definitely want to make sure that the organization is really well connected, because a lot of times we kind of have the unfair advantage of being in this so long, being a manufacturer of the hardware, being a network operator, being a service technician based to the hardware that's in, where the majority of network operators are just a network operator and they're bringing in third-party hardware, right? So now that network operator is reliant on that third party to have components. So really kind of do your due diligence on that. That's I would say the number one thing. The reason why chargers are down in field is because a component is missing and they can't get access to it.
Right. So just in the last couple of minutes, where do you see the landscape in sort of 5-10 years from now?
I think it just gets more exciting, right? I think part of, like, look at this year and last year, like there's amazing vehicles on the road now. Back in 2017, you could pick between the Jelly Bean and something else, right? Now everything is so much sexier, and it's becoming again what I said, the mainstream side. So I think it's only going to get more exciting with the vehicles. The charging is going to get faster. It's getting more reliable. That technology is really changing, and overall, people are really waking up to what EV charging brings to their property from that time-based piece that customers are spending. And that can be from 15 minutes to an hour, right? Even that 15 minutes is enough to go in and spend $20 on a bag of chips and a pop and something else. So it's a great business case for adopters.
So as we get deeper into this in the last minute or so, what is a Canadian Tire store going to look like in terms of?
That's hard to predict. I think if I could tell you what we'd look like in the next 10 years, I'd be doing something else for a career. I think it's, again, continue to listen to your customer. Again, I go back to first principles. That's our touchstone, is the consumer. And what's important to them, where are they moving? And then take advantage of what's happening in the economy. I mean, policy drives a lot of this sometimes, but you got to know where your customer is and use that as a touchstone. And again, I can't overemphasize, partner with people that have the same passion for that customer. Then there's a lot of alignment. You may not agree on how to get there, but there's at least alignment on we need to delight the customer with this, whatever we're doing. So we continue to iterate. We're on a very steep learning curve. So I don't know I can tell you what the end goal is yet. It's, again, continue to iterate, learn, modify, adjust, and again, continue to work with good partners in the space.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Brookes Shean from FLO, Andrea Ongaro from Canadian Tire, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Great talk, and thank you all for being here.